Hello, my name is Daryl Robert Chun. This is January 2013. And in this program, I'm going to review where we are today. When I presented my paper before the Positive Deviant Network in March 2007, it was a 148-page analysis of where the U.S. economy was headed, and I talked about the crises that was right in front of us. I didn't know when it would happen, but I was quite certain that it would. And not only was I quite certain that a crisis would happen, I was quite certain of why it would happen. In March 2007, the media and most people did not believe a crisis of the magnitude that was going to shake world markets was in the offing. Things may have been a little dicey, a little uncertain, but they always are in capitalism, where credit and debt form the basis of markets, where the balance between credit and debt always has to be fine-tuned to keep the expansion from getting too far in front and to keep the contraction from getting so deep as to stop the economic momentum itself. And so we had moved constantly into an expanded economy. And what I knew, though, the crises were increasing in intensity and in rapidity. And this was going to end badly. In March 2007, even though I predicted it, did not know how soon it was going to happen. And so I presented my 148-page paper before the Positive Deviant Network in March 2007, and I predicted real estate would fall 40 to 70%, that the stock markets ultimately would go down and lose 70 to 90% of their value, and it was going to be worse than even the Great Depression. Why? Because a monetary crisis would accompany the collapse in demand that had happened during the 1930s. And so in the foreword to my book, I wrote, "The air is going bad." What do you mean the air is going bad? The sky is not blue. It's dirty and turning brown, and there's more. There's more? Yes. The water's not too good either, and something's wrong with the weather. The air's bad, the water's not good either, and something is wrong with the weather. Next, you're going to say something's wrong with the money. Well, now that you've brought it up. And that's how I began Time of the Vulture, How to Survive the Crisis and Prosper in the Process. And on the next page I wrote, when stocks lose their value, that's a terrible thing. When homes lose their value, that's a terrible thing. But when money loses its value, that's the most terrible thing of all. And as we start moving into 2013, I want to tell you that that is happening today. I saw that happening when I presented my analysis, and it's embedded in the analysis. I put out a third edition of my report last summer. And even though it was really written in its entirety in 2006 and predicted a crisis of huge proportions, when I went through and brought it up to date in little nuances here and there, I was struck by how correct in its structure my predictions had been. Granted, it was written in 2006 and 2007 when the world was different, or at least it appeared to be different. It appeared to be stable. And because many of the things I predicted since then have come to pass, it appears that Time of the Vulture may perhaps be dated. I want to assure you, those of you who are now understanding, as few did then, that gold and silver are a palliative to keep your assets safe during this crisis ahead. But I want to assure you that if that's what you got from my book, you missed a large part of the message. Because the financial crisis is only part of a far greater crisis that is sweeping not only the markets, but our lives. And as we are here in January of 2013, the crises that I predicted that had not yet happened when I presented my report not only has happened, but we are moving quickly into a far more dangerous stage here in 2013. 1 year ago, central bankers were still hoping there would be a recovery in the latter half of 2012. That the monetary easing that they had put in place, called QE2, was finally going to take hold, and by the fall of 2012, you would see a recovery in the markets. What happened was the summer of 2012, it didn't appear that that was likely. Europe started failing badly. Its economy entered the second year of a contraction. And as we moved into the fall, not only did Europe worsen, but Asia continued its slowing down. The rise of Asia was basically fueled by the excess credit from the West that consumers spent excessively since 1980. The rise of Asia happened because the United States embarked on the greatest expansion in the history of capitalism ever. This expansion of monetary easing went first into the stock market. Multiples. By the 18 years later, in 1982, the Dow Jones was at 777. For those of you who do follow stocks, the idea of the Dow being at 777 seems almost absurd. It seems like maybe your life when you're at the age of 2, and now you're in your 20s. But the expansion, the rise of the Dow from 777 to its high, I think, of around 11,200 or somewhere abouts in the year 2000, was the greatest increase in the stock market in capitalism's history. Now, capitalists patted themselves on the back, as did central bankers. Alan Greenspan was knighted by the Queen of England for his steady hand on the helm that not only has seemed to reverse all the ups and downs that always happen in credit and debt-based societies and economies, had smoothed out the ups and downs, and of course set us on an upward path forever. Hopefully. Well, forever ended in the year 2000. The 1,600, or I think it was 1,800% increase in the Dow over 18 years was the fastest rise of stock markets that had ever happened. But it wasn't fueled by an economic expansion. Though an expansion did happen, but nowhere near 1,800% as reflected in the stock markets. It was an expansion of credit and money aggregates that went into the equity markets. Money chased itself and drove stocks higher and higher and higher. And like the heroin addict who is so happy because his friend has knocked over the local drugstore and he has first dibs on the drugs that he's getting, Wall Street was happy as a pig at the trough. What was about to happen was a collapse of the very game that the bankers had set in motion. And in 2000, stock markets fell radically. And the U.S., to keep it from collapsing totally, slashed interest rates from 5.5% down to 1% and set in motion the U.S. property bubble. Do you remember that? Do you remember that? When you could buy a house and the next year it's now worth 10, 15% more than the year before? Do you remember that? Do you remember when you could sell your house and there'd be a waiting line of people waiting to buy it? Do you remember when banks were the prime issuer of mortgages in the United States? Do you remember that? Today, 90% of mortgages are purchased by the U.S. government. Why? Because there's no private money waiting to take the long bet that in 30 years you're going to pay off that loan you took out. So only the government, and the government money is there to support the real estate market. And the U.S. is talking about a real estate recovery. Well, when they take the patient out of intensive care, maybe then. And what happened at the end of 2012? Central banks, seeing that QE2 didn't work, announced in the summer of 2012 that QE3 was going to begin. Another round of monetary easing was necessary to hopefully revive the U.S. economy. An additional $45 billion a month was going to be pumped in to the U.S. economy, just like it had during QE2. Now, QE1 and QE2 had already gone through it. It's like chemo. You've already gone through 2 rounds of chemo, QE1 and QE2. Now, if you're on the 3rd round, what does that mean about your first 2 rounds of chemo? It means it didn't work. And now, in 2012, not only are we on QE3, the 3rd round of chemo, it's double the amount of chemo that they had in QE2. And in QE2, they told you, oh, this is going to last until X date. Why? Because chemotherapy is a highly destructive process, and if you are exposed too long to these dangerous drug regimen, the patient could die. And you knew that in QE2. And now the doctors have walked in, the same doctors, Ben Bernanke, Timmy Geithner, and the boys who were there with that drip, drip, drip of QE1 and QE2. They came back into the room in the fall and they said, well, QE2, the last round wasn't as successful as we thought. We're going to give you another round. And not only is QE3 another round of chemo, they just told you in December it was going to be double and continue until you got better. I want to tell you, the patient is going to die. And perhaps not of the disease itself, the disease that they've been fighting, called a deflationary collapse in demand, the inevitable result of excessive credit buildup, building up excessive demand, building up excessive supply, and when that collapses, you're left with a deflating economy, a collapse in demand, and huge amounts of debt that can't be paid off. So that's why they put QE1 and QE2 in, hopefully to substitute for the collapse in private demand. Private demand went south. Why? Because savings became more important. Households all of a sudden cut spending after this extraordinary spending spree that they'd been on for 20 years. And not only did consumers stop spending, corporations stopped spending. Corporate coffers, corporate treasuries have more money in them than they've ever had in history. There's a reason. They're paying down debt as fast as they can. They're putting money away because they know it's not safe out there, and they're putting it away like a bear builds up his stores for the winter. A winter that has only just begun. And the U.S. economy, QE3 they just announced. Unlimited monetary easing until the patient revives. Well, if QE1 didn't work, if QE2 didn't work, more of the same is not going to. It's like pouring more gasoline in a badly flooded engine. The recent released FOMC reports showed there was a lot of dissension on the Fed, within the Fed, about QE3. Now, these boys are trying to fix a system that blew itself up. The central bankers are responsible for what happens in the credit and debt-based economy. And they tended this thing since 1980, poured as much credit as the markets wanted, poured as much credit in it as governments wanted to borrow, and now it's broken. And this is where we are. If the economy does not collapse from the deflationary loss, which has happened in the 1930s, it was moribund, people were out of work, and Obama, he's like FDR. He's trying to take some of that money that's still there and keep people from starving. But he's also trapped by the system that elected him. He's trapped by the Federal Reserve. He's trapped by the military-industrial complex. Not only is he trapped, we're trapped. But I'm here to tell you that the collapse of the bankers' economy, the inevitable demise, either from the deflationary collapse in demand that is going on right now, that this year that is going to absorb Japan finally after a 22-year fight with deflation. If that deflationary collapse in demand, which is exactly what happened in the 1930s, does not suck not only Japan, not only Europe, but ultimately the United States into its magnetic maw. If that's not the cause of the demise of the bankers' economy, it's going to be from the excessive money printing that central banks have now embarked upon. This is like the doctors walking into the room and telling you, not only is this last round of chemo going to be extended indefinitely, they are going to pour more chemo, deadly chemicals into your body, hoping to kill the economic cancer that's eating away at the guts of the bankers' economy than they've ever done before. They're not doing this because they know it'll work. They're doing this because they're hoping it will work. And all of us are watching them do it. Now, when I wrote this book, Time of the Vulture, I said you were going to need faith to get through the days ahead. I laid out the case for an inevitable deflationary collapse in demand. I used the example of Japan, what had happened in Japan after 1990, 89-90, after its massive stock market bubble collapsed, driving Japan into a deflationary cycle that for 22 years it has not been able to escape. And the sequential collapse of the dot-com bubble and the real estate bubble in the U.S. are every bit as destructive as the collapse of the Nikkei in 1989, 1990. And the foolhardy attempt of the EU to challenge the paper U.S. dollar, so they issued a paper European currency has now set in motion such economic dislocations that the European Union is disassembling as I speak. And the miracle of Asia's rise, that was hope by the West that might bail it out, has been built purely upon Western excess demand. And as that excess demand falters, the excess supply built up in the East will falter also. Everyone is in the same boat. The whole is in that boat. We are different. We are just situated in different parts of the boat. In the end, if you were not on the few life rafts of the Titanic, did it really matter if you were traveling steerage or first class? Did it really matter if you couldn't get back to your cabin, or if you'd locked the room and you were praying on your knees for safety after that hole got ripped in the Titanic? Faith is what is going to get us through. Now let me tell you what I see happening. When I talked about the collapse of money, I didn't tell you that I personally thought, in the end, it was a good thing. Now, why would I think that the collapse of the global economy, the collapse of our monetary system, is a good thing? I think it's a good thing because we are living in a prison of debt servitude. I think it's a good thing because for the last 300 years, the world was infected by a virus that the bankers put in motion, first in England. And this virus was so powerful, it fueled England's war machine that almost took over the whole world. A dinky little island off the coast of France created the largest empire since Rome. And let me assure you, it wasn't because their navies were more vicious. Head to head with the Turks, I'd put my money on the Turks any day. How could a small nation like England create an extraordinary empire that, it was true, the sun never set on? It was because they were able to fight war on credit, on the bankers' loans that they gave to the King of England, that forced every country to put a war machine up, because the next country, it's like real estate. It's like real estate. Let's say you want to buy a house and you're a prudent man. You save your money. And you want to buy a house, and your neighbor and their neighbors, you're all looking for the same house. And you all have access to credit. You think that house is worth what? $200,000? But let's say you and all your neighbors have access to a lot of credit. More than $200,000. How far do we have to go back to see that? 2006. So you bid 180. Neighbors bid 220, 240, 260. And that house eventually went for $380,000. Why? Because everybody was in the same game and had to outbid each other to get the prize they wanted. That's why military spending is so large on the planet in every country. This is the world that's over. A world of peace is coming when the world of war collapses.